We're going to talk about privacy impact assessments, what they are and what they aren't, and why businesses do it. So in terms of privacy impact assessments, every organisation around New Zealand, around the world, sees their risk differently. So one person's privacy risk for a small charity may be very different to the same risk when posed for a bank. The other thing is everyone's implementation of business process and technology is different. So there isn't one size fits all or a shop where you can go and buy all these privacy impact assessments ready done. And we'll come on to a bit more about how we go about them later. So the first thing we need to think about is, why does it actually matter? Why does privacy matter to individuals? So in terms of society today, most people believe privacy is essential. However, it is difficult to define what privacy is, and everyone will have a different viewpoint. So for some people, things like how much they earn, what their last performance rating at work was, are super sensitive to them. But others are more than freely and readily happy to share it with everyone in the office who wants to know about it. So it is hard when it comes to assessing privacy risks because it is based on cultural norms. For example, if we were talking about privacy in India, they have very little concept of it. It is perfectly okay there for their employers, for the government, to know every inch of their life, and that is the norm there. It is also useful to know that in terms of expectations, we have some varying different legal basis. So, for example, in some states in the US, privacy is a human right. In Europe, it is generally believed that privacy is a human right there too. In the US, however, privacy is viewed as a right to privacy in one's own home. So it tends not to extend out into things like the workplace or out in the public. Whereas Europe, it's more about dignity and how we can express ourselves, etc. In New Zealand, we're in a bit of a unique position. We have more a view about it being a right to privacy, but also a right to unreasonable freedoms for things like unreasonable search and seizures, discrimination, etc. In terms of our view of privacy, we're moving in New Zealand away from compliance view of it and much more about trust and confidence. So there is a direct correlation between how happy people feel using your service, how happy they feel with giving you information, and trust and confidence as to how your privacy compliance is working. But even within that, we have differences. So for example, the government sector are held to a much higher bar than private enterprise. Now that isn't in legislation anywhere, but it is in things like the state services expectations around data collection. It is also in around things like the work that the Government Chief Privacy Office does. So even within our society, where we only have one piece of legislation, even within that, we have different norms. Thinking about it though, the world is changing too. So one of the key things before we crack into any privacy impact assessment is to think about, what are we assessing against? So we know, for example, that any project we do here in New Zealand, the New Zealand Privacy Act will apply, but also thinking about what else applies. So for example, if you're selling goods and services into Europe, then the GDPR will apply. If you are marketing to 50,000 Californians, then maybe CCPA applies. And those are quite important pieces to know before you kick off in your privacy impact assessment as to what are we looking at? What legislation, for example? Other things that are changing though is around how we deliver services today. So things like, we're seeing an increase in things like Internet of Things, AI, So over lockdown, we have had more requests to do PIAs over bots and chatbots than ever before. But also things like CCTV and the use of big data. So big data in terms of data analytics for things like contact tracing have become really hot topics in New Zealand. And our social norms and perceptions of those are changing as well, particularly as a reflection of lockdown. So people are now much more aware of their privacy in terms of contact tracing, but also in some cases much more willing to give you personal information for the greater good of New Zealand as a whole. So when we think about privacy risk, there isn't one way of measuring privacy risk, and privacy risk is subjective. So there isn't a sort of black and white scoring scale on it. So if we think about risk, we need to think about a few things. First of all is, how do we quantify it in terms of impact and likelihood? But also, what are we going to do with that information? So part of that we have is things like risk scoring charts. So for example, a lot of organizations have a 5x5 quadrant about how we would rate risk within your business. If it becomes in the red area or the dark red area, even in some people's, then it would need to be escalated to the executive team, for example. Now, across government, they tend to have a pretty standard scoring chart called the All of Government chart. But each agency does have their own variations, and that needs to be fit for your agency and your risk profile, so your organisation. So, for example, a small startup where money is tight may be willing to take an awful lot more risk than a government department, and that will be reflected in their scoring. Also thinking about how we communicate the risk and what happens to it within our organisation, and we'll talk a bit more about that later. So, what is a PIA? So a privacy impact assessment is generally a process where we go and identify the effects or risks associated with something that is happening. Now, in some cases, that might be a new piece of technology being introduced. However, it is generally pretty hard to assess the privacy impact assessments of just a piece of technology, because the technology does not use itself. There are business processes, there are people involved in this. So it is generally better to assess the privacy of an end-to-end journey for something, so a customer journey. That does mean, for example, that privacy might be assessed over changes in legislation, for example, so increased sharing under legislation. It might be over that introduction of that chatbot, but it will also be over and the processes that your agents use within your contact center to actually interact with that chatbot, and those processes for customers to deal with it. In terms of the PIA, it's generally there to serve two key purposes. It is there as a communication device. So it is there for your business, your leaders to understand what privacy risk they are accepting or currently have. But it might also be there to enable you to communicate that privacy risk to a wider audience, like members of the public. So if we look to Australia, for example, their COVID tracing app, they have published the PIA so that all Australians, or in their case, all around the world, can review it and comment and make an informed choice about what they wish to do. The other thing a PIA is useful for is for assessing and mitigating risk. So in order for it to be effective, therefore, it has to be done before the end of the project. If you do the PIA at the end of something 3 days before you go live, it doesn't give you much opportunity to avoid or mitigate any of those risks before you go live. So it is really important time-wise, and we'll talk a bit more about that later. In terms of PIAs, not one point here have you heard me mention the word compliance. So a PIA should not be about compliance. It will give you a lens on your compliance, but if your sole reason for doing a privacy impact assessment is to assess your compliance, you are likely not to be getting the true gains out of this. In terms of New Zealand, we commonly see PIAs used as a compliance exercise. And the business just doesn't get the value for money out of that, and generally doesn't buy into why they'd even want to do it if it's a compliance exercise. So in terms of why we want to do it, as we spoke earlier about, the key thing we're looking for usually is about informing people. In terms of that, it's about allowing people to understand the risk, allowing people to understand what is happening and what is going to happen to their information and what may happen to their information. But as we said earlier, it is also used as a good thing to build trust and confidence with people. And as we said, even in New Zealand, we have the PIA issued by the Ministry of Health for the New Zealand tracking app, so that they can build the trust and confidence of New Zealanders into using that. Now, when we spoke earlier about legislation, it's really important, as we said earlier, to know what legislation your service, product, business process is going to cover. Because, for example, under GDPR, so the European privacy legislation, some projects, some business offerings, it is a requirement to have a PIA, or in their case, they call it a DPIA. So that stands for Data Protection Impact Assessment. In all sense, it is the same thing. If you are required under legislation, though, to do a PIA or DPIA, it is worth checking before you crack out your pen and paper whether there is a set template for it. So, for example, if you have to do a PIA for the English regulator, the ICO, they have a set template they would like you to use. So you don't want to have to do rework to find that you're on the wrong template. Other things people use the template, use PIs for is to avoid legislative fines, regulatory fines, but also negative publicity. They are a good thing to be able to show and say, look, we did think about this and we did work through the risks, etc., associated. So if we think about that, the question therefore should be, why should we do a PIA? So in terms of that, for government, it's predominantly about trust and making sure that we are doing the right thing by the New Zealanders, by our staff. For a private sector, though, again, it is still a big focus on trust. But also sometimes for private sector, it's about revenue protection, reputational protection, for example, and also consequences for breaches of legislation, and how maybe they could be judged both within New Zealand but also overseas for those breaches. So if we think about it, do we actually need to do a PIA? So this is the first question we should think about. Not everything we do in our business will require a PIA. So generally the first point of the process is to do what's called a privacy threshold assessment. So this generally takes the project team less than half an hour, and it's generally a sort of questionnaire thing to establish what the project is up to. And at that point, it will pull out what are the key privacy risk areas that may cause a privacy impact assessment to be done. Now, as we said earlier, everyone's risk tolerance is different. So, for example, some organisations will say as soon as you are using a third-party vendor to deliver any part of your solution that involves personal information, we want a full PIA done. Other people will say, as soon as you are doing anything involving more than 10,000 customers, we want one done. And that is up for your business to establish where your risk threshold sits. And it's really important to get that balance right. It is about what risk will you accept versus what workload and money do you want to spend on doing these PIAs. In general, depending on your business, approximately about half of your projects will find that they don't need a privacy impact assessment. That said, if you are, for example, a bank where everything you do is about personal information and about someone's life, then you might well find that that is closer to 80 or 90%, versus someone who maybe deals with the farming sector, where actually most of your projects are about sheep, beef, etc., who don't have privacy rights. So the first thing we need to understand for us to kick off a privacy impact assessment is what is the personal information involved. Now, that is a very broad question. And if you go to a project team and say, what personal information do you use? You are likely to come back with a really varied answer. So for example, if you were building a project that put in sensors of smart metering for your electric use, you might say, well, actually, no, that's just about electric use for a property. But if you think about it, if only one person lives there and we have their smart metering, we know what time they went to bed, what time they got up, where they went to work, which some people would say is, you know, not on the super sensitive end of personal information. However, when you then consider if they start growing a large amount of marijuana in their house under industrial lights, that actually you are going to tell something is awry. And actually, you're going to have to disclose that information to the police. Now, in terms of that project, if you had done a privacy impact assessment, you would have picked up those items about that potential disclosure to the police, and you would have also picked up potentially that your privacy notice didn't actually inform individuals that that may happen. So how do we go about doing it in your organization? So there is no one way of doing a PIA. Each organization will have their own ways of doing it, and there is no right or wrong way. The key thing about it is to ensure that you have your buy-in from your business and your stakeholders into the method you use. And there is also no one way that a PIA comes out of this. So some people, for example, write pages and pages. We've got one customer that their average PIA starts at 30 pages long. It's got everything you ever need in it. Then we've got other organisations where their average PIA is closer to 3 or 4 pages long, and it just has the pertinent points in it. So it is about what is appropriate for your organisation. So before we start, we need to think about who is our audience for this. So how you approach a PIA that is going to be made public is very different to how you're going to approach one that's going to be used internally. But even then, if it's going to be used internally, who is your audience for it? So for example, if your PIA is only going to be consumed by your legal department, it may be okay to write about impacts to information principle number 3 in it, okay? And that might be fine because that lawyer who's reading it will generally have a good understanding and will know what you're talking about. But if that same privacy impact assessment is going to be published to the public, or even go to a business owner somewhere else in your business, they're not going to know what on earth you're talking about. The other thing to think about if it's going public is making sure you set the scene in it. Why is your business doing this project? Making sure that we don't use a million acronyms that no one who doesn't work in your business would ever understand. So now we know what we're going to write roughly, or what style of writing we're going to use, but when are we going to do this? So as we said earlier, if you leave your PIA right to the very end of your project or your initiative, there is absolutely no room to make any changes. So you've kind of turned it straight into a compliance exercise. What generally is better is to actually commence the PIA at the beginning of the project. Now, when we say commence, we don't necessarily mean put pen to paper. But what we do mean is by having the discussions with the project, identifying risks as you go along and then make design decisions, and working with them on it. So it is not unusual, for example, for a project, maybe he's doing a big RFP, to kick off their privacy impact assessment from just before they actually select their preferred vendor. And the reason for that is that if the very high level privacy impact assessment at that point identifies there are risks that maybe can be mitigated through contractual terms, then you can put those in before you sign up with that vendor. So for example, if your privacy impact assessment identified that you are going to need to be subject to GDPR, and you are subject to mandatory breach reporting, like we will have in New Zealand from hopefully the 1st of November, and you don't have contractual clauses in for that, then you are most probably going to want to address that as part of mitigating that risk to ensure that that vendor is responsible for those items. Now, it is okay if you kick off that PIA at that point and there are loads and loads of unknowns. That is absolutely fine. You need to assess the risk as you understand it at that time. And as things come to light or business processes get developed or changed, then you are going to need to keep iterating through that PIA and updating it. Now, that might be updating it in your head. It might just be a risk table, but without any of the other words in it. It is really up to you and your business how that works for you. But the key thing is it is an iterative process and it needs to be started early. So there are a couple of differences though, traditional versus agile. So depending on how your project kicks off and what delivery method, you might want to handle your PIAs differently. That said, the content of your PIA is generally the same. So for example, if it's a waterfall project, you would generally do your threshold assessment that we spoke about earlier during the definition phase. At that point, the project will establish whether they need to do a full PIA. And if they do, it will be started to be developed during the design phase. We'll start and do that initial thinking and be finally signed off just before the go live. So after the test, before go live. However, if you work in an agile space, what you may want to do is sign it off per release that you do into the public or into the environment. So you'll use a more iterative approach and update and re-sign off the PIA per release. In terms of that though, rather than having it, if you are an agile project, of signing off every 2 weeks, there is a kind of process where we go, actually, is this increment or iteration actually changing anything about privacy? Because if it's not, then there is no point in re-signing off that PIA every 2 weeks. But there needs to be a thought process which goes through to actually assess whether it is that way. Now, it is useful to know what delivery method your project you're working with is actually going to use. And the reason for that is it can inform what kind of template or writing style you use for your privacy impact assessment. So for example, if you are developing an agile project, you are likely to want to put a lot more data, a lot more information into the risk table, rather than writing vast amounts of wordy paragraphs. The reason for that is it's a lot easier to update the risk table than it is to review pages and pages of wordy paragraphs where the changes may be needed across 3/4 of the paragraphs at the time. So it brings us on to the form of it. So in terms of it, as we said, there is no one form. There are some off-the-shelf options you can take. So for example, the New Zealand Privacy Commissioner has some templates on their website that you can use. If you're a government department, the Government Chief Privacy Office have some templates again that have been subtly customized for government that you can use there. There is no right or wrong template. It needs to be what works for your business. Now, to give you some ideas of the ends of the spectrum, it could be, as we said, 4 pages of writing, up to, it could actually be a fully automated form where the business unit fill in questions and you put the risks alongside it. If you use one of those fully automated methods, they are absolutely great because you have a central compendium of stuff, but they do take a while to set up. But it can, if you have a large flow through of regular projects, those can be really useful technologies to have. But as I said, there is no right or wrong way or right or wrong template to use. So what are we actually going to write about in this PIA? So the key thing is to make sure that actually the person who's reading this actually knows what you're doing and why. It is one of the most commonly missed parts of the PIA ever. And therefore, when you look at the risk table, you can't get the context of it. So it needs to set the scene about what is happening, what happens today, what's going to happen in the future. Maybe a bit of information about what are the business processes, who's involved in this project, etc. So it needs to really sort of set the scene of what's going on. It will then always have a risk table to describe what the current risk level is and what the projected risk level will be if you put additional controls in. It may also have things like flow diagrams. So it is a lot easier for people to understand how information flows work if they can see it in pictorial form. So you might have a picture in your PI that shows the end-to-end process. So it has a stick man with a picture of him collecting information, right down to a picture of someone popping it in the secure recycling at the other end, and what happens during that process. It may also have architectural diagrams from an IT perspective to show how systems work together. And again, those sort of decisions are made on a per project basis. It needs to be what is needed in order to convey to that audience what they need to know. There will also be a discussion about privacy analysis. Now, in terms of that, the older templates we used to have used to go through principle by principle and have a very compliance-focused discussion about how each principle is met. More and more now, we are seeing a shift to talking about the project life cycle, so the collection, use, disclosure, retention, disposal, and away from principles 1 to 12 or 1 to 13 coming up shortly. The key reason for that is because of that common thing we spoke earlier about is the audience. Most audience will not want to know or care which privacy principle it is that is going to be non-compliant. What you can do if you've got multiple audiences is have your risk table and have a column for the principal number so that that lawyer who does want to know what principle it is can cross-reference. But then also that layperson in your business can actually understand it from their impact. In terms of that, it will then also generally have recommendations on how to mitigate the privacy risk further. The key thing for those recommendations is they need to be appropriate to your business. So thinking about costs, timelines, complexity to implement, because not all of those are going to get taken up. But if you can make them achievable, you have a lot more chance that the project team are actually going to action them and see the value in it. If you come up with recommendations that are for millions and millions of dollars, people are just going to gloss over it and not actually take it for the value that could be achieved from it. So we're going to start our PIA. So the first thing we need to think about is where we're going to get all this information from. Now, depending on the organisation you have, a number of them will be really rich in documents. Others will have no documentation about any project. So it is know your business. If you are a business that is highly document-based, then you might have things like a solution architecture, a security assessment, maybe business process flows or operating procedures for frontline staff that have already been drafted by the project. In other projects where you come in to do the PIA, all you've got is 6 willing people in a room who would love to tell you about the project. So you need to take whichever method works for your organisation to do that. First up, we generally have a kick-off meeting. So we generally meet with the key stakeholders and understand what they're trying to get out of it and more about their project, and also have an understanding of how the PIA is going to get done. So in terms of people at that session, it needs not to only be your IT team. And we see this really often, that privacy impact assessment is the IT team's problem, or it is only the business's problem. Generally, that kickoff team will have people from all over your business involved. So it will have IT, it may have someone from a vendor, it will have business people, it may have your contact center in, for example. So you need to think about who is going to be impacted by that project and get those people in. Then think about how do we communicate with those people throughout the project. So some of those people, it's going to be really important to understand how you communicate with them. Do they like it in writing, or they would prefer a face-to-face chat about it? My general recommendation would be that you have a workshop with those key people and you actually go through the project lifecycle end to end and actually talk through with them. The reason I say that is if you tend to use a questionnaire or have very fixed questions, you're generally going to miss privacy risk because you're too focused on it being a compliance exercise and getting the answers that have been prescribed by your organisation. So in that workshop, if we're going to think about collection, or in our PIA document, we might have a section called collection. So in here, we would be talking about what kind of information are we collecting. Now that might be collected from members of the public, but it might also be things like collecting information from our staff. So for example, if you have built a portal that allows applications from customers for something, you will also have behind the scenes information about how your staff process them, what time, who it was who made decisions on them, etc. That will still all be potentially personal information about your staff and their activities at a time. So we need to make sure when we do the collection that we have all information we're collecting from all parties and make sure we have looked wide and get everything we need. We also then look at how do we collect that information. So for example, if we have an online form and we ask for your date of birth, we'll be looking to see, well, actually, do we need to know your date of birth? Or for example, do we actually need to know that you're over 18? If we needed to know that you were over 18, then we would most probably identify a risk that we were collecting too much information in a specific form, whereas we could have been collecting it in a less intrusive form and less information using maybe a tick box to say, is the person over 18? Yes, I agree, I am. Also, particularly thinking with the changes to the Privacy Act, but also the sensitivity, are we collecting ID information we don't need? So it is really common for a lot of people to think that they want to collect a copy of your driver's license, passport, and birth certificate for every service we ever build. So, you know, thinking about, do we actually need it? Do we have anti-money laundering requirements to know our customer? Do we have other legislative requirements to know our customer? Or do we just think we're collecting it because that's what everyone else does? So we might find that we have risks around too much information being collected. We may also, in some cases, find we have risks around too little information being collected. And that will be predominantly where there is a risk that we then can't identify one person from another if we need to at a later date. So, for example, if we need to re-identify someone in our system and we only collected their name for them, Fred Smith, we are going to have a really big challenge later on if our business process needs us to re-identify Fred Smith and check his record for something. So we may have risks around too little information being collected. We'll also be looking at risks around collection methods. So for example, under the Privacy Act, you should be collecting information directly from the person it's about, if practical. The risk around collecting information to sign someone up to maybe, say, a raffle from their husband or wife is most likely pretty low. Okay, so we signed up them for a raffle, yeah, no big deal. But if we were taking third-party people signing others up for maybe a home loan, we most likely want to take a lot more checks and balances to make sure that information is accurate. So we may, for example, pick up a risk that the person was unaware that their information was being provided by someone else, or that actually the information that third party provided was incorrect. So even if you think about husband and wife sort of relationships, if one of your questions was how many children do you have, it is not always the case that the other partner actually knows the correct answer. They think they do, but if it's important to you that it's 100% accurate, you may want to think about that risk and what you can do to mitigate it. Also thinking about how we go about collecting information. So this is about being fair and reasonable in our collection. So for example, if we were going to look at CCTV and collecting CCTV within our office, there is a difference between having a really high definition video and the ability to zoom in and out, which is very intrusive, to a low res fuzzy image where we can just about at a push make out, that one blob is maybe different from the other. So thinking about how we deal with those scenarios. Then moving on, as part of collection, we also need to think about how we give information about the privacy notice. So as part of that collection piece, we'll be looking at the privacy notice that relates to the collection, making sure that it aligns, and also making sure that it is in an understandable form so that people can actually deal with it. Then we move on to the use section. So we'll be looking at this point about how is the business using data? Is it for the purpose they told the people that they were going to use it for? But also in this place, thinking about what other data is used as part of the business process, and is that actually been authorized previously? So for example, if your business process involved you cross-checking that the person didn't already have a debt with your organization in a different system, not only would we want to think about what information are we using to look up that debt, but also whether that historic debt information you had could actually be used for this purpose. So that may involve you cross-checking and seeing what you said in the privacy statement originally about whether it could be used. Also thinking though about what other uses are happening. So there's the main flow through your business process usually, but then there's usually some exception processing. So when someone bounces out of your process, how do you then go about using your data? And actually, some of those processes can actually be the highest risk processes around. So do you use the information, for example, to then create a police report? Do you use it to then do an investigation into someone or for fraud purposes? The other one that's commonly picked up at this point is also about use in test environments. So it's a classic risk we see really often. We've got your production data, but then we go ahead and we use your production data in test, meaning that we have additional risks around that, because generally your test environment has a lot more access to it, has generally lower security, and has no retention period applied to it. So suddenly you've got a lot of risks around that second copy of the data. The best advice I can give for that one is don't use production data in test. It is a recipe for disaster usually. So then thinking in your PIA about what happens to the data after we've got it. So do we need to disclose it to someone else? So we spoke earlier about the electric monitoring. So in that PIA, we would have had a section about disclosure for law enforcement reasons. So if we see a scenario where the electric usage appears to be disproportional to everyone else in the street, then we will need to make a disclosure to the police. So we will be looking at that point to see, how is that disclosure done? Was the person made aware of that disclosure? How does the business process work for it, etc. But also thinking about unauthorized disclosures. So all of us working from home or just slowly returning to work, our risk of unauthorized disclosure has been a lot higher. So one of the best places to see disclosure at work is when you travel on the train or you sit in the Corrie lounge. The number of people who can see you following a business process, overhear your conversation, etc., are all things that would need to be thought about. So some things you could mitigate, for example, some people only allow certain systems to be used when you're within the physical office because of the sensitivity of the information. Or if you need to use them in the field, then maybe you should be providing privacy screens to those high-risk staff. So they're all quite manageable changes that could be made. Also thinking at this point about if you're a government department or even private entity, who else do you share information to? So for example, government, we have a lot of cross-government information sharing. So if, for example, I'm going to build a system to record new deaths in New Zealand, as a result of using this system, the business process and legislative provisions mean that the death information would then be shared with hundreds of other organisations around New Zealand. So how does that flow? Is it actually within legislation, or do we need to ask people, gain consent, etc.? But even for private enterprise, that could be a disclosure to your parent company. And I raise that because particularly thinking about disclosures to overseas entities. So as we spoke about a few weeks ago, the changes to the New Zealand Privacy Act mean we need to be really careful around disclosure. So particularly overseas disclosure, because that is where the new principle is being brought in. So when we're looking at disclosure now, in advance in PIAs now, we'll be looking, is that an overseas disclosure? And if so, how does that fit with the requirements of the new Act? Or does it not? And actually we have a risk that we will be non-compliant because of certain scenarios. But also thinking not only about ourselves, what are the risks if we have vendors involved? So risks of disclosure from them can be quite high. So going on then, we think about retention and disposal. How long are we going to keep it? Now, every week when I come across projects, we're doing privacy impact assessments, my favourite comment for a project team is, I'm keeping it forever because we haven't worked out how long we should keep it for yet, but I'm sure someone will deal with it later. That later will not come unless you flag a risk that retention is a problem. Nobody will remember 18 months down the track that that system has no retention built into it. So even if the project are not going to deal with it in the first release, that risk needs to be flagged so that someone does remember it exists and will deal with it. But also thinking about what is needed to be kept. You know, we can keep everything for a rainy day, but if we're going to keep records maybe for old customers who left 5 years ago, then the likelihood is the whole of that customer record's out of date anyway. So why have we kept it? The customer's moved, they're likely to have changed email address, etc. So it's most probably useless to you anyway. So there's no harm in getting rid of it. Before you do crack out and get rid of everything though, if you're a government department, please make sure you check the Public Records Act before you decide to suddenly have a mass purge out. And that is one of those documents that would be an input into your PIA to be checking the retention schedule and ensuring that your project is actually in accordance with it. Then thinking at that point also, going to keep the information, where are we keeping it? So we talked another week about things like Maori data sovereignty. So, you know, are we going to keep it in Australia? Do we need to keep it on shore? And what control do we have over where we keep it? So other things over and above the project, over and above the information lifecycle that usually come out in the PIA. How do people actually enact a Privacy Act request? So this may be both your formal process, but also your informal one. So how do people actually access their information and go about correcting it? So is that a portal where they can log in and see everything so they don't have to make a Privacy Act request for it? Or is that there is a business process where they ring up Fred and Fred will go in the system and deal with it? That process needs to be considered and documented as part of the PIA. And particularly important to the Privacy Commissioner at the moment is the access and correction. That is something they are very hot on because it actually has direct impact on people. Also thinking though about what are your contractual relationships? So with those third parties you're using, how sure are you about their privacy maturity? Have they actually signed a contract and does it have the clauses you actually need in it? So for example, does it have clauses saying they can't use the data for anything else? Or is there a clause in that contract that says actually the vendor can use the information for building statistical norms or for improving their products and services? Also thinking about breach notifications and subcontractor restrictions. And if you're interested, last week's video, it's available on the website, all about how to assess our third parties. At this point, we would also usually pick up around the security. Now, most people have a security team who do a wonderful job and would have assessed the security of the information in this system. So at this point, rather than reinventing the wheel, it's really useful to pick up those artifacts that they've already done. So that might be a security risk assessment or your penetration testing, etc., and actually assess those and see if anything they have identified is actually going to create a privacy risk. So for example, if the penetration testing showed that you had built a piece of Swiss cheese, then in your privacy impact assessment, you most likely want to call out the risk of being hacked is reasonably high because your penetration testing has shown that you have left every door and window open going in your solution. So we've done all of our risks and we've now got a whole list of wonders. What we then need to do is write them down into the risk table and assess them. So the first thing to think about is how we write them down. So the key thing to this is who is your audience and who are you asking to accept this risk? So it needs to be in language that they understand. So if you're asking a business owner to accept the risk who is maybe responsible for the contact center, then writing IPP3 is not met because 3A is not included in the privacy notice is not going to be very helpful to them. They won't know what it is and they won't be able to make an informed choice about making that. Whereas if you wrote, the privacy notice available on the website doesn't say that we disclose information to police, and we may do this, you know, on a regular basis, then that's something that that business owner can understand and make an informed choice about. So then thinking about rating them. So they will have generally two ratings for them. They will have the inherent, so as it is today, with the controls that are planned. And then they will have a residual risk. What is it if you do more controls that you're proposing? And as we said, everyone will have their own risk rating table for their organization. So make sure before you start rating your risk that you actually have the table for your organization. If you don't have one, the All of Government risk rating table is particularly useful and isn't too heavily weighted in one direction or another. So you will end up with a table of risks, usually somewhere between sort of 10 to 20 is quite common for a PIA. Some will be less, some will be more, depending on what you've built. But you will end up with sort of 10 to 20 of them. My personal preference is you all order them by highest residual risk first. But that is personal preference for your organization. Then thinking about, so what happens to this great report? So at this point, we need to make sure, first of all, that the business owner who needs to accept this risk has read it and they understand it. So that might be that you need to sit with them and actually go through and talk with them about it. Other business owners will want to sit and read it and then ask questions about it. But the key thing is that the person who needs to accept the risk needs to have understood what it is. Then it is not really the place to pop it in the drawer and forget about it. That identified risk needs to be managed. So that might be that those risks are put into your central risk tool for your organization, or that your privacy officer manages them through a separate spreadsheet process or another process to go through. Also, depending on your organization, some places actually have a process of memos to be signed off to make sure that that risk is fully understood and accepted. So that may have to happen outside of the PIA process. So thinking about how we make our privacy impact assessments more effective. The key thing to the privacy impact assessments is about taking the project on a journey, making sure that they engage with you and making sure that they actually see the value in it. So for a lot of people, actually, the value for them is not in the written report, but it is about the conversations that you had as you got there, to give that project additional help or pointers as you go along. And the key thing, if you have been successful, is that the project teams are trying to engage with you. So rather than you chasing your project teams down around your organization, if they are coming to you wanting to do PIAs, wanting to understand the privacy risk, you have done the right thing. And that is a really good sign of success within your organization. So how can we help? So we do PIAs across all sorts of things. So that may be business process, technology, cloud. And again, they can be in any format that you want. But the key thing is one size doesn't fit all. So before we all rush out and know that, I know, for example, Organization A did a PIA across Salesforce and the Salesforce processes last week, there is no point in going and grabbing that PIA and then taking that and thinking it will fit your organization. They need to be tailored and they need to be about what you're doing, not about what your colleagues have done.